Tonight's topic is BDS of Israel, successes to date, and the campaign to boycott Eurovision in 2019. We have two eminently qualified speakers to speak to you. Our first speaker will be Mona Abu Zalaf, who's a final year law and journalism student at UTS, and she's also a Palestinian activist. And Mona's going to speak.
Good evening, everyone. So my name is Mona, as Mary has just mentioned. I, like Helmi, am the daughter of a Palestinian refugee. So my grandfather was expelled from Palestine in 1948. They moved to the refugee camps of Lebanon, where my father was born and grew up, and then they moved to Australia eventually, and here I am. I guess I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm going to be starting us off with a little bit of history, not too much. I'll try not to bore you. Sorry, it's just, I'm a bit too short. How many of you have kind of had some history on this topic, just so I know how much detail to go into? Okay. So, most people know their stuff, so feel free to challenge me if I get something wrong. I'll go through a bit of the history and kind of get to where we are today, talk about some of the current issues, why international law has failed us, which links, I think, very well into why we need BDS, what BDS is there for, and what BDS is doing at the moment for Palestinians. Just to touch on some historical periods that are quite important, I think. So pre-Nakba is what Palestinians call the catastrophe, which is what happened on May 15th, 1948, when Israel was created, and we had a mass exodus of Palestinian refugees, my grandfather included, of about 700,000 Palestinians having to leave their homes in Palestine because of the creation of the State of Israel. Before Nakba, and maybe perhaps if we begin in the late 1800s, we had the rise of Zionism, which is often thrown around when we talk about this topic. And my understanding of Zionism is that it's a political ideology. You don't have to be Jewish to be Zionist. You can be atheist, you can be Muslim, Christian, whatever you want. Zionism, my understanding, the fundamental tenet really is a Jewish homeland in the state of Palestine. And part of the reason that's justified is because, well, Jews have suffered a lot. They've faced a lot of persecution. There's been a lot of anti-Semitism. So if they can have their own state, they'll be safe. To me, I think that justifies anti-Semitism everywhere else in the world. If you're saying that Jews can only be safe in one place, it's like, oh, okay, well, let's expect them to be, persecuted in other countries. I think no. I think you don't need a state to be safe. You shouldn't face anti-Semitism anywhere in the world. You shouldn't need a state to have to be safe from that. So that's my issue with Zionism. But basically, Zionism has been the catalyst for the creation of the State of Israel, and there was a lot of lobbying done during those periods to kind of get that happening. And of course, the lobbying, went hand in hand with the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. There was obviously a lot more reason for a Jewish state to be created when you've got all these attacks against Jewish people elsewhere in the world. At the time, Palestine was still under the Ottoman Empire. At the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire fell and Palestine came into the hands of the British. The British established a mandate, and we start to see some rising Jewish immigration. Around the 30s, we kind of heats up a bit, and we get some Arab revolts against this Jewish immigration as well. And we kind of get the first discussions of partition plans. We get the Balfour Declaration, in which Britain promised the Jewish people a homeland in Palestine. And so we start to see this discussion about creating the State of Israel. I guess what's important to note at the time was, it wasn't all roses and fairies. The Jewish people, I don't actually know, the Zionist people did have their militias. There was the Haganah, the Stern, the Ergon, the people who later formed what we now know as the Israeli Defense Forces. So these were happening. These were real, threats to people's safety. We had the bombing of the King David Hotel, which, killed British people as well as Palestinians and others. So this wasn't just some kind of, peaceful time in history. In 1940s, I think Britain realised they got their hands over too much and needed to get out. So they kind of handed the issue over to the League of Nations, now known as the United Nations, and that's when we got the official 1947 partition plan, which divided up the state. I've got some basic stats up there, but if you just read these statistics and forget about the people for a second, just imagine, you had a pie, you owned 80% of that, and yet 56% was given to someone else. How, just unjust is that? Imagining your property being taken away from you, something you had lived and worked on just being taken away, even though you had done nothing to deserve that. Your home gone, you're told you're going to come back, but you never get to. Just imagine the shock of having to leave that. Well, that's what happened. Quite frankly, that's what happened. Jewish-owned land was only about 7%, and yet they received 56% of the land at the time. After that period, there was a fair bit of wars. We had the 1948 war, we had another one in 1967, which we often mark as the start of the occupation, which is the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which has continued till today. And then we also, had all these lovely little negotiation processes that happened along the way with Palestinians and Israelis trying to reach peace through negotiations, even though Israel was still occupying Palestine at the time and still had basic control over the whole territory, and yet there would still be this thing called negotiations. And that's, I guess, where we landed in 1993, where we have that historic, photo of Bill Clinton and Yasser Arafat, shaking hands, and that's, when we all thought everything was going to be great from here on in. Personally, I think it's only gotten worse, but we'll see in a minute why. So I've just got some images here to kind of contextualize all the stuff I just said, make it a bit easier to see. So this is one of the classic images that you see of Palestinian refugees leaving their homes at the time. At the time, there was, over 700,000. Today, they number in the 5 million, roughly. These refugees have a right of return under international law, under UN Resolution 194, and that includes their descendants. So people like me, my dad, we have a right to go back to Palestine. Obviously, we haven't been given that right. If anything, it's been negotiated away by the Palestinian Authority. But one of the arguments Israel likes to use on this point is that, well, we can't have 5 million refugees return. Like, that's just going to throw off the Jewish majority, which is what they want. Now, that's got its own issues. Not going to attack that just yet, but it'll throw off the balance of the demography of the state. But there is a right of return for every single Jewish person out there that has just been completely legalized and affirmed, even though we already knew it in the recently passed nationality bill. So any Jewish person, even though they've never been to Palestine, never even thought of it, can go back. And they'll have subsidized housing, all that fun stuff. But Palestinians who were there just 2 generations ago have no right to return. I don't know. To me, it's a little bit unjust, but what do I know? So this, I think, is a really important image to show because a number of reasons. I mean, you can see just how unjust it is when you look at how much land has been taken and continues to be taken. And it also shows, I think, one of the flaws of the two-state solution, especially when you think about the 5 million refugees who are still living outside of Palestine and still hope to, return to their home one day. But if you think about it, where are we going to have this Palestinian state when we've got these 2 completely disjointed land areas, and especially today when we've got the settlements eating into the West Bank itself? Now, we're not here to talk about, the 1 or 2 state solution, so I'm not going to get into that, but I think that's just a good point to mention when we look at maps like that. And all of that leads us into where we are today, which is, put it bluntly, a shitfest. We've got the failure of the peace process. The most recent, notorious one was the Oslo Accords, which I mentioned before. And if I just show you in a second what happened. So we had the West Bank, which is, the Palestinian state. And what that did was divide the area into 3 pieces, A, B, and C. I can never remember which is which, but one of them is under complete Israeli control, which I believe is Area C.
C, which is the remote area.
Area C.
And it's about 60% of the West Bank, as you can see. So that's completely Israeli. That's off the table. That's, aside from historic Palestine.
Sorry,
We're talking
which is the area C there?
the red.
Oh.
Yeah, the big one.
Oh.
Yeah, basically, most of it. Then we've got area A and B. One of them is completely Palestinian controlled, and that means militarily, like as in security forces of Palestine, and also like civilly administered by Palestinians. And then the other one is just, civil administration, but Israeli security control. And of course, regardless of where you are, ABC, Israeli military is occupying the whole thing, so they can go in whenever they want anyway. So really, distinction without a difference. Of course, if you're Jewish, there are all these signs like it's not safe to go into the Palestinian areas because, Palestinians are savages and they'll want to attack you, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, that's a load of crap and you'll be totally fine going in. Just don't get caught by Israeli soldiers. But I think this is, again, really important to show that the peace process has landed us nowhere. Because if you're negotiating with someone who's got a gun to your head, you're just going to give them what they want. There's no bargaining power. You don't negotiate with someone when you haven't got the bargaining power. And that's why BDS is so important. I know we'll probably get into this later, but BDS is giving Palestinians the bargaining power they haven't had for years and years and years. And that's why BDS is, so important, and actually, giving Palestinians some power back in their lives, I'd say.
Can people go freely between areas A and B, or do they have to cross purely Israel?
Palestinians, you mean?
Yeah.
Checkpoints.
Checkpoints,
There's
yeah.
nothing free.
So I guess what I wanted to show you from that is that the peace process has gotten us nowhere. It's just gotten matters a lot worse. The Palestinian Authority, although they're an authority and all these countries have recognized the existence of a Palestinian state, it's again a load of crap. Like, Palestine has, as a state, no power. Personally, I think it's problematic to recognize a state that has no power, because you're just legitimizing the facts on the ground and not actually getting anywhere nearer to peace and justice. And what this also does, recognizing Palestine and also, working with Israel, whether you're performing or going on a lovely holiday, what you're doing is you're normalizing the occupation of Palestine and you're normalizing apartheid. Yes, apartheid, throw it out there. The occupation, when we talk about it in this context, refers to the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So the Gaza Strip, although yes, Israel pulled out in 2005, they have no boots on the ground, what they do have is a complete naval blockade as well as a blockade of the land. So they have complete control over what goes in and out of Gaza. There's been a blockade, I want to say, for about 11 years, if I'm not wrong. And there's actually been deliberate calorie counting to make sure the Palestinians don't die of starvation, but also don't, get too excited over there with their food. And that's actually had really, really real consequences in terms of, having food, having medicine. People have died on the borders because they can't get out to access medical help, basically. And this is not even mentioning, every time Israel feels like having a massive war and killing thousands of people. I'm not even going to go into that. That's, totally fine. They can do that. But this is just the day-to-day of Palestinians who have no control over their lives. They're living under an occupation, whether that be through checkpoints or whether that be through a naval blockade. On the West Bank, it's the opposite, especially in those areas where the Palestinian Authority exists and acts like they mean anything. So although, there is a government, what goes in and out is also controlled by Israel. The borders are controlled by Israel. There's no real sovereignty for the Palestinian Authority. And if this is more so to do with apartheid, but if I could just actually, this is good. So I don't know if anyone is going to get copies of this, but this is from Visualizing Palestine website. They have like really, really good infographics that kind of discuss all the issues really, really in a nice way, and they're also really pretty, which doesn't hurt. But this just kind of outlines all the issues with control of various resources. So for example, water. So the Palestinians in the West Bank who, technically the aquifers are on their land, Israel controls those and they get their water from Israelis. Things like internet access. Palestinians only got 3G very, very recently. So imagine that. As soon as you left the house, no more internet. Only have internet where you have Wi-Fi. Just imagine that for a second. And of course, because Israel controls everything that goes in and out, they can add whatever taxes they want, and everything is much more expensive. So these are kind of the more day-to-day things that people face, and that's of course aside from the checkpoints. So you're traveling from one city to another city, you've got to have your ID on you, because you're going to have to go through a checkpoint, and if someone wants to be annoying, they can ask you for your ID, you haven't got it on you, they can stop you. And there are plenty of cases where people have just been arbitrarily imprisoned, having done nothing. The other thing I wanted to discuss on the point of, the one-state reality was this system of apartheid. And apartheid is basically a legal term for, it is a legal term for when, there's a system of governance that favours one group over another. That was recently enshrined in the Nationality Bill, where Israel affirmed what it's been saying all along, that it's a Jewish state, which basically means it's a state for Jewish people. That doesn't mean they don't have other people, they definitely have other people. They have minorities living there, but the state is for Jews. And there's a distinction between what nationality means and what citizenship means. If you're a national, you're Israeli. If you're a citizen, you're fine, you can be whatever you want to be, but you don't have the same rights and opportunities as a Jewish person. And this is why there is a system of apartheid, because there is one state controlling the whole area, and that includes the Palestinian territories. Israel has final say over what happens in the West Bank. They maintain the occupation over the West Bank, therefore they are the government. If you get arrested, you don't go to a civil court in the West Bank like a Jewish settler would. You would go to a military court. You don't go to civil courts in the West Bank. And where this has kind of led us in terms of, the United Nations, international law, and all these things that we're saying are wrong, but nothing's happening about them, well, there's a reason. It's called the United Nations. It's also called veto powers. The way the UN works is basically, there's the Security Council, which, is where all the big dogs sit. There's 5 countries that have a veto power. If they don't like something, not going to happen, no matter how wrong it is. And that's where, all the enforceable stuff can happen. That's in the Security Council. The General Assembly, on the other hand, most countries represented there, but no real power of enforcement. And so what happens in the Security Council is this. The US just vetoes stuff all the time. And if you look at the stats for what the US has vetoed, 27% of the US vetoes have been in favour of Israel. So we can see why things don't actually happen in terms of change being seen on the ground. If I could just go back to that. So kind of the key issues that are happening at the moment, the things that are ongoing problems, the things that have not led us to peace, are these things. It's settlement expansion. Settlement expansion is a big thing. Israel likes to make out like it's actually not a big problem. It's a big problem. It's a violation of international law, and that's been affirmed time and time again by the United Nations. And basically what they continue to do is move their population into areas they occupy, which is against the 4th Geneva Convention. And what that does is eat up the land that is supposedly going to be a Palestinian state one day. And so that makes, creating a Palestinian state impractical on the ground. And think about it. Who would want to kick people out of their homes? Sure, it was done in 48 to the Palestinians, but that's fine. Why would you want to do it to Jewish settlers again? It's just, it's a horrible kind of turning point, and they always throw it back on Palestinians, like, oh yeah, well, we can just move the settlers out, but really it's not going to happen. Like, it's very impractical. We have collective punishment, which is also a violation of international law happening in Gaza. So, Israel will be like, oh, it's Hamas throwing rockets, which actually do nothing, but okay. Throwing rockets into Israel. And then, of course, Israel has to go and bombard Palestinians and, just indiscriminate warfare, even though Israel clearly, they have the power, they have the military strength, military capabilities to prevent such disastrous attacks on civilians, yet they choose not to. What do I know? I'm not the 4th, strongest military in the world. And what that has led to is collective punishment. So the entire population of Gaza is facing punishment because of the actions of a few, and whether that be through the literal drop of bombs or through the naval blockade, that's what it is. It's collective punishment, and it's wrong. There is the denial of the right of return, which I spoke about earlier, those 5 million people waiting to go home that never get to go home. We have a military occupation in the West Bank. Of course, there's still an occupation in the Gaza Strip, but I mean military occupation as in you see Israeli soldiers wherever you are in the West Bank. And then we've got what I think is one of the worst things, And that's apartheid, a system that favours one group over another. And this apartheid is everywhere. So it's not just in the West Bank where, you've got that separation of, Palestinians go to military court, the Israelis, even if they're settlers, go to civil court. Apartheid is also within Israel proper, and that relates to that exact thing of favouring Jewish people over non-Jewish people. Access to, subsidised land, specific towns where you actually can't get in unless the council approves it, and the council, is just a bunch of Zionists. So this is what I mean by Israel is practicing apartheid everywhere, not just, within the occupied territories. And so this has led us neatly into the importance of BDS. So I mentioned earlier that kind of international law has failed because there's no power to enforce unless you're, one of the big dogs. One of the big dogs being the US. The US, we all know, is not exactly an honest broker, considering the billions of dollars they give to Israel in aid, considering they just handed over Jerusalem to Israel, even though the international community was like, please stop, don't do it. They did it anyway. And when you have the US acting as the broker between Palestinians and Israel, I mean, it's very hard to see how Palestinians are going to get a just peace from that. And so international law has failed in that regard, that enforcement can't happen because there's too much politics behind it. And that's why we need BDS, because BDS is giving power back to Palestinians. It is saying that no, it's not normal to go and perform in a country that says that one group is better than another. It's not normal to want to go on holiday in a country that, favours Jewish people over everyone else in the state. It's not normal to go and, perform in a country where they've been occupying a piece of land for 50 years, continually eating up that land, murdering Palestinians in Gaza, imposing a blockade. That's not normal, and it shouldn't be normal. And that is why we're going to discontinue working with Israel, discontinue visiting Israel, discontinue buying Israeli products, so that they know that this is not normal behaviour and it needs to stop. And that is what will give Palestinians some power. It will give, Palestinians, one day in 30 years, when they go to the negotiation table with Israel saying, please, we need our economy to work again, that is what will give them some power. Because at the moment, and I blame the Palestinian Authority for this equally, what's happening is they go in, they have absolutely no power, and what Israel say goes. And that's part of the problem. We need to stop negotiations because it's not working, it's getting us nowhere, and if anything, it's only, turning us back. So BDS is the way of the future, and I think Helmi is going to talk much more about that, so I will hand over to him now.